The snow had been falling since 3 in the afternoon, and by the time Ethan Brooks finished loading the last box into the bed of his truck, the street was white all the way to the curb. He stood for a moment in the cold, barehanded, breath rising in slow clouds under the amber of the streetlight, looking up at the window of the apartment he could no longer afford. The light inside was off. He had turned it off himself before locking the door, had stood in the dark hallway for a moment, doing nothing in particular, and still now, he looked up at the dark rectangle of glass, as though something might be visible there. Sophie had fallen asleep in the passenger seat 20 minutes ago, her coat bunched against the window, one boot half on, her breath fogging a small oval on the glass. She was 6 years old, and she had asked him only once where they were going. He had said to a nicer place, and she had believed him completely, the way children believe things when they have no other choice and no particular reason to doubt. He was aware of the weight of that trust. He carried it the same way he carried everything carefully, without much outward evidence of the effort. He was about to climb into the cab when he remembered the shelf. He had built it himself 2 years back, from pine bought at the hardware store on Clement Street, measured, cut, sanded, stained a dark walnut, mounted level on the north wall of the bedroom. He was good at building things. He had forgotten it when he packed, which said something about the state he had been in for the past several months, the way exhaustion erodes the peripheral awareness first, the things at the edges of what you meant to do. He went back inside. The apartment was empty and cold, and smelled of old radiator heat, and the faint chemical ghost of the cleaning solution the landlord had required him to use before vacating. His footsteps were too loud in the bare rooms. He crossed to the bedroom, ran his hand behind the shelf before pulling it free of the brackets, an old habit, checking for gaps before committing to a removal, and that was when he felt it. Something wedged in the narrow space between the board and the plaster. He pulled it out and held it under the light from his phone. A journal, bound in dark brown leather. The cover warped slightly at one corner from old moisture, the spine still intact. No label on the outside. He opened it to the first page more out of reflex than intention, the automatic motion of a man who fixes things and needs to understand what he is holding before he decides what to do with it. The handwriting was neat, economical, slightly left-leaning. At the top of the page, a date 9 years ago. And beneath it, in the same careful hand, a name, Victoria Hale. Ethan stood very still in the dark apartment, with snow ticking against the window glass, and his daughter asleep in his truck outside. He knew that name. He had sat across a conference room desk from the woman who owned it for exactly 14 minutes before she had looked up from his resume, set it down with the same deliberate care one uses to set down something of no particular value, and told him the position had already been filled. He had thanked her, he wasn't sure why, exactly. Some reflex of professional courtesy, and walked back through the impeccable lobby and into the January cold. He had driven home in silence that afternoon, changed out of his only good shirt, and fried eggs for dinner because it was what they had. He had not thought about it since. He had practice, by now, at not thinking about things. Now he stood holding her journal in both hands, snow outside and silence inside, and he could not immediately identify the right thing to do. The shelf came off the wall without resistance. He tucked the journal into the box under his arm and walked out into the street. The city of Ravenhill sits at the edge of a river that freezes for 6 weeks every winter. And the cold that comes off the water is a specific kind, damp, low pressure, the kind that moves through whatever you are wearing and settles in your joints before you have identified the source of it. Ethan had lived here for 11 years. He had come for a job in building systems maintenance, stayed for a woman named Claire who left when Sophie was 2, and remained after that because leaving requires energy. And for a long time he had none to spare. He knew the city the way people know places they have worked in rather than merely lived in. By its back entrances and mechanical rooms, its service corridors and loading docks, the buildings whose HVAC systems were sound, and the ones held together by workarounds and deferred maintenance, and the specific expertise of men who had been doing the same fixes for 20 years. He had repaired boilers in old hotels on the north side, replaced compressors in restaurants he could not afford to eat in, spent an afternoon in the crawl space of an office tower on Meridian Avenue, tracing a duct leak, while the people working 2 floors above him answered emails in climate-controlled comfort. He had never resented this arrangement. He understood it. None of it had made him wealthy. Some months it had barely made him even. He did not dwell on this as failure, because dwelling was a form of waste he had learned to avoid. He was the kind of man who fixed things, who could read a broken system and locate the fault and restore the function, and he applied this same discipline, imperfectly but consistently, to everything else. The habit of diagnosis was useful. The habit of accepting what the diagnosis revealed, even when what it revealed was not what he had hoped, was harder and slower to develop, and he was not certain he had finished developing it. He had been 24 when he arrived, carrying 2 tool bags and a certification in commercial HVAC systems, and the belief, not yet disproven, that competence was a sufficient argument for opportunity. He had been broadly correct. Competence kept him employed through the years when construction slowed and companies cut their maintenance contracts and the margins on his kind of work got thinner. What it had not done was accelerate the pace at which his life was moving, which remained, in most years, the pace of a man keeping up rather than a man getting ahead. Claire had understood this better than he had. She left when Sophie was 2, not with cruelty, not with anger, with the kind of honesty that is painful, precisely because it is honesty and not something you can argue with. She needed a different pace. He was not going to provide it. She still called on Sophie's birthday and sent gifts selected with genuine care, and Ethan bore no complicated feeling about any of this, except the occasional recognition that their arrangement was probably more civilized than most, and that civilized arrangements require, quietly and invisibly, a great deal of ongoing effort from everyone involved. Sophie did not seem damaged by any of it. Children adapted to what they were given, and what Sophie had been given was a father who showed up every single day without exception, and a mother who showed up carefully and consistently from a distance. And this seemed, so far, to be enough. She was a deliberate, observant child. She watched the world with an attention that sometimes made Ethan feel she was the one keeping notes on him rather than the other way around. The whiteboard in the kitchen of their new place, a 2-bedroom apartment on Archer Street, that's Tongue Trust. 2 handwriting rentier, utilities, groceries, Sophie's after-school program, truck insurance. He tracked everything in blue marker and erased the columns at the end of each month. And the act of erasure never felt like progress, only like reset. The numbers were precise, because imprecision was something he could not afford in any register. Mornings he walked Sophie to school. She wore a red coat with a broken zipper he had sewn shut with fishing line, and she held his hand through the park that separated their block from the school's entrance. The park in January was stripped and gray, the benches dusted with overnight snow. The fountain turned off and covered in burlap wrap, tied with nylon rope. Sophie liked to name the pigeons. She had named the same 3 birds 7 different names over as many weeks, and seemed to regard this as entirely consistent behavior, requiring no explanation. "That one is Captain," she announced on the morning after the move, pointing at a bird indistinguishable from any other bird. "Captain," Ethan repeated. "He was Gerald last week, but he did something brave." Ethan did not ask what the bird had done. He had learned that Sophie's internal logic was self-consistent and required no external validation, which was possibly the healthiest relationship with narrative he had ever encountered in another person. Nights were harder. After she was asleep, she went quickly, efficiently, like someone completing a necessary task. He sat at the kitchen table with the whiteboard and whatever work he could find. Dispatch calls for emergency HVAC repairs. A few consulting hours for a property management company across the river. He had applied for 43 jobs in the past 8 months. He kept a spreadsheet. Column A, company. Column B, date applied. Column C, response. Column C was, in all but 4 cases, blank. The interview at Hale Dynamics had been the closest he had come. He had prepared for 2 weeks, read everything public about the company's facility portfolio, studied their building addresses, and cross-referenced them against what he knew about those blocks from his service work, rehearsed answers in the bathroom mirror at 6 in the morning while Sophie ate cereal in the next room. He borrowed a tie from his neighbor, Douglas, a retired electrician who owned 3 ties and had apparently Ethan drove to Meridian Avenue, parked 2 blocks away, walked through the cold, and sat in the glass-walled waiting area, watching the river through the north window. The building was immaculate. He could assess building systems from a lobby, the air quality, the temperature balance, the absence of any mechanical noise that shouldn't be there, and this lobby was excellent. The kind of invisible infrastructure competence that required serious investment and serious oversight to maintain. Whoever ran facilities at Hale Dynamics knew exactly what they were doing. He had thought, sitting there, that he might actually have something to offer these people. Victoria Hale had come in 12 minutes late, offered no apology for this, and looked at his resume for approximately 20 seconds before asking one question about his experience with large-scale building management systems. He answered with the specificity his work required. She looked at the resume again, and then she told him, without cruelty and without particular warmth, that the position had been filled internally and she was sorry the interview hadn't been canceled before he made the trip. 14 minutes. He thanked her the reflex of professional courtesy, deeply ingrained, and walked back out through the excellent lobby into the cold afternoon. That evening, he erased column C next to Hale Dynamics and entered. Position filled internally. He had not thought about it since. The journal sat on the kitchen table for 3 days before he opened it again. He was aware, without self-deception, that reading it was wrong. There was no reasonable argument to be made in his favor. The journal belonged to a person who was alive and findable, and who had left it behind, presumably by accident, in an apartment she had once occupied. The right thing to do was simple and clear, and he knew exactly what it was. But he did not do it immediately. He told himself this was because he was busy. There was a dispatch call on Tuesday evening. A burst pipe in a building 2 miles east that kept him there until midnight, and Sophie had a school presentation that required a cardboard model of a weather system that he helped her construct on Wednesday afternoon, sitting on the kitchen floor with scissors and glue, and her very specific requirements about where the cotton ball clouds should go. But the truth was simpler than busyness. He was tired in a way that made even correct decisions feel heavy. And the journal sat on the table with the particular presence of something he had not yet decided the meaning of. On the third night, after Sophie was asleep, he made coffee and sat down and opened it. The entries from 9 years ago were professional in their surface register observations about a company going through what he recognized, reading in sequence, as a period of serious structural instability. Notes on staff numbers, project timelines, funding shortfalls, language that had the compressed quality of someone recording decisions for their own reference rather than for any audience. The handwriting was consistent throughout, tight, controlled, with certain words underlined with a pressure that scored the page slightly, as though the act of writing them required some additional physical emphasis to make them stay. Between the professional entries, slipped in without preamble or transition, were other things entirely. A paragraph about walking by the river in February when she needed to think, the particular color of the ice at its edges, where the current ran underneath, a description of light through a specific window, at a specific hour of the morning, the way it fell across the desk, the quality of it in winter, a sentence, near the bottom of one entry, written smaller than the surrounding text. I wonder sometimes if the people in this building know that someone is working very hard to keep them here. He read that line twice. Then he read it a third time. He cross-referenced what he could from public sources, archived press coverage of Hale Dynamics from that period, a profile in a regional business journal, old corporate filings. The company and the journal matched. The timeline matched. The board members mentioned only by initial matched, with some confidence, the kind of institutional figures he could find in documents from that era. He read carefully, the way he read technical specifications, looking for what the document was actually saying beneath what it appeared to be saying. He read for 2 hours. At the end of that time, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a while, and then looked at the window, where the snow had started again and was falling silently against the glass. The woman who had ended his interview in 14 minutes had, 9 years ago, stood at the intersection of 2 paths and chosen the one that cost her more. She had been offered a clean solution. Cut 43 positions, restructure leaner, secure her own standing in the organization and the confidence of the board. She had refused it. The journal documented In her own hand, the alternative she built instead, a financing arrangement that carried significant risk of failure, a longer and more uncertain recovery timeline, and the daily awareness that if it collapsed, she would have cost the company far more than the positions she was trying to save. Near the end of the section, a short entry. Q1 projections held. Nobody lost a job. Nobody will ever know this was the choice. He read that last line 4 times. Then he closed the journal and carried it to the shelf above the refrigerator where Sophie could not reach it, and went to bed. He did not sleep for a while. He lay in the dark and listened to the snow and thought about the phrase "nobody will ever know," and what it meant to write something like that, not as a complaint, not as a plea for recognition, but as a plain statement of fact in a private document that had spent 9 years wedged behind a shelf in an apartment nobody remembered her living in. He thought about it for 5 more days. The honest accounting of his options was not complicated. He could mail the journal to Hale Dynamics with a brief professional note and no elaboration. He could call the company and explain what he had found. He could do nothing and let the journal sit above his refrigerator for however long it took him to work up the resolve to do one of the other 2 things, which was a third option and probably the least defensible. What he did not let himself consider, not seriously, was whether there was anything in the journal that could help him. He was alert to his own motivations in the way that people who have needed things for a long time learn to be watching for the point at which genuine feeling curdles into something self-serving, watching for the moment when a reasonable impulse becomes a rationalization for an unreasonable one. He had been watching for that point his whole adult life. He had not always caught it in time. He tried to catch it in time. Douglas knocked on his door on a Thursday evening, ostensibly to return a level he had borrowed 2 weeks earlier, but mainly, Ethan suspected, because Douglas was 63 years old and lived alone and liked to talk. He accepted the coffee Ethan offered, sat at the kitchen table, and told a story about a building inspector he had known years back, who had found a cache of letters inside a wall during a renovation correspondence from the 1940s, apparently significant, addressed to someone he could not identify. The inspector had spent 4 years trying to find the right recipient. Did he find them? Ethan asked. Found one. 2 others were dead by then. The third one didn't want the letters and seemed annoyed to be asked. Douglas drank his coffee. He kept the box in his garage for 18 years after that. Couldn't throw it away. Couldn't find anywhere for it to go. What happened to it eventually? His wife gave it to a historical society after he passed. They were apparently very pleased. Douglas paused and looked at his cup. I'm not sure there's a clear moral there. There might not be, Ethan said. After Douglas left, he sat at the table for another 20 minutes. Sophie had drawn something before dinner, a house with an enormous sun. 2 stick figures of unequal height in the foreground, the taller one holding what appeared to be a wrench. He looked at the drawing for a while. He was not naive about what the journal represented in practical terms. In the wrong hands, in the hands of someone who wanted leverage, or a story, or a way into a conversation they had not been invited to, it was a thing with uses. He knew the dynamics of institutional power well enough. Had observed them in enough buildings where he serviced the infrastructure, while the people above him made decisions, to understand that people with authority did not enjoy having their history held by strangers. The potential for discomfort was real. So was the potential for something worse than discomfort. But he was not interested in leverage. He had never been interested in leverage, which was one of the reasons his life had taken the shape it had. He was interested in being the kind of man that his daughter, when she was old enough to be looking for that quality in people, would recognize without hesitation. He would go to the building on Meridian. He would ask to leave something for Victoria Hale. He would leave it, with no note and no agenda, and no expectation of anything in return. Then, he would walk out through that excellent lobby and go back to his life. That was the plan. It did not quite survive its first contact with what actually happened. He went on a Friday morning. After the school drop-off, he wore a clean jacket and his better boots, not the borrowed tie, not the interview clothes, and he told himself this was simply because he was coming directly from the school run, rather than because presentation was itself a form of argument. He knew it was both. He had the self-awareness to know it was both without letting that knowledge stop him. The lobby of Hale Dynamics was remembered it. The measured air quality. The silence of systems operating precisely. The particular quality of a well-managed building that communicates competence before you have identified anything specific. A young man at the reception desk asked if he had an appointment. "No," Ethan said. "I have something that belongs to Miss Hale. I'd like to leave it for her. I can take that for you. I'd prefer to give it to someone who can confirm it reaches her directly, her assistant, or whoever handles that." The receptionist studied him for a moment with the careful expression of someone performing a risk assessment with incomplete information. Then he picked up the phone. Ethan stood in the lobby and looked at the air intake grills near the ceiling. The ductwork was newer than the building suggested, retrofitted, probably within the past 6 or 7 years, the seams cleaner than the original system would have produced. Someone had invested seriously in this. He was calculating the approximate scope of the project when he heard footsteps behind him. "Mr. Brooks." He turned. Victoria Hale was standing 6 feet away, in a gray jacket, with the same expression of contained evaluation he remembered from the conference room, not unfriendly, not warm, simply present and assessing. "You have something for me?" "Yes." He took the journal from inside his jacket and held it out. "I found it in the apartment I was moving out of, on Carver Street. I looked up the address on one of the early pages. I think it was your previous address. From about 9 years ago." She looked at the journal without reaching for it. That restraint was its own kind of information. She was not performing composure. She simply had it. "You read it," she said. "Not an accusation, a logical inference. Some of it. Enough to be certain it was yours." A pause. Outside, pigeons moved on the cornice above the entrance. He could hear them faintly through the glass. "And then you came here. I thought about mailing it. I wasn't confident it would reach you personally." He paused. "And I wanted to tell you directly, I'm not going to do anything with what I read. I'm not interested in what I could theoretically do with it. I found something that belonged to you, and I'm returning it. That's all this is." Victoria Hale took the journal from his hand. She turned it over once, ran her thumb along the warped corner of the cover, and held it against her side. Then she looked at him for a moment, in a way that was different from the conference room, more direct, as though she was seeing something she had not expected to find in that particular location. "I'll have my assistant validate your parking," she said. "I took the bus." A brief pause. Something moved across her expression, not quite amusement. Something quieter than that. "Then I'd like to offer you coffee," she said, in the flat indicative she apparently used for everything. "My office. 10 minutes." Her office was on the 14th floor, at the corner where the building turned to face both the river and the main avenue. The windows were new, he could tell from the quality of the thermal seal. The way the cold outside was completely absent from the air inside. Good installation. He noticed this the way he noticed all building systems, the automatic professional appraisal that happened before the conscious mind caught up with it. She poured coffee from a carafe and set a cup in front of him without asking how he took it. Black. He accepted this as either indifference or efficiency, and chose efficiency, because efficiency was more consistent with everything else he had observed about her. The journal was on the desk between them. Her hands were flat on either side of it. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they had made a decision to stop thinking about. "And the decision is now complicated. Which parts did you read?" "The first 40 pages or so. Up through the end of February of that year. I stopped when I was certain it was yours." "The first 40 pages." She said this without inflection. Neither accusation nor forgiveness. "Then you read the section about the board decision." "Yes." A silence. The river below was flat and gray, under low cloud cover. He watched her face and found it readable only in outline, not discomfort, not anger. Something more layered and more careful than either. "The mathematically correct decision," she said, "was to cut the positions. Every advisor I had said so. The numbers were not complicated. In a restructuring context, reducing headcount by 43 was entirely defensible and probably necessary for the company's long-term stability." She picked up her coffee. "What made it complicated was that I had told those 43 people, directly and personally, that I would make every effort to protect their positions. I said that because I meant it. I was aware when I said it that meaning something and being able to deliver it are not always the same thing. But you found a way to deliver it, Ethan said. I found a way that could have failed very badly. If the financing arrangement had collapsed, and it had a reasonable probability of collapsing, my financial team was explicit about that the company might not have survived at all. We would have lost those 43 positions, and possibly another 150 besides. She looked at him with the level directness he was beginning to recognize as her natural register. I made a bet with other people's jobs as the stakes. It happened to come through. The journal doesn't read like a bet. It reads like a plan. Plans are what you call bets when you want to feel more certain about them. She paused. I was not certain. I was committed. He turned his cup once on the desk. The people who kept their jobs, they never knew how close it came. No. Does that matter to you? That they don't know? She considered this with genuine attention, not performing the consideration but actually doing it. He appreciated this more than he expected to. I think the outcome mattered. I'm less sure the knowledge of how the outcome was achieved would have helped them. She paused. I wrote it down for myself. Not because I wanted recognition, because I needed to be honest with myself about what I was doing and why. The journal was the mechanism for that. He was quiet for a moment. Then, that line near the end of the section. Nobody will ever know this was the choice. Yes, you wrote that, and then closed the book and went back to work. Yes, she said again. He looked at her. She held his gaze without moving. And he thought that this was a woman who had spent a long time being very clear-eyed about things that were not comfortable to be clear-eyed about, and who had found some way to sustain that, without hardening into something brittle. Why did you come in person? She asked. Honestly, I thought mailing it was avoiding something. I'm not sure what I was avoiding. But I didn't want to avoid it. She looked at him for a moment more. Then, you were laid off from your previous position. Yes. What are you doing now? He told her. He was specific. The dispatch work, the consulting contract, the scope and nature of the jobs he had been picking up. He described a compressor replacement on Clement Street, where he had respecified the unit against the owner's preferences because the energy calculation didn't support the like-for-like replacement. He described the 40 minutes it took to persuade the owner, and the method he had used. She listened completely. At the end, she made one note on the pad in front of her. We have an opening, she said. Director of Facilities Operations. It's senior, the full portfolio. 11 properties. Capital planning and day-to-day, both. I'd like you to come in for a proper conversation about it. This wasn't that conversation, because I showed up unannounced. Because I have 3 meetings before noon. She stood, which was apparently how the meeting ended. My assistant will reach out to schedule. Does that work? Yes. She walked him to the door with the efficient courtesy of someone who has made a decision and is already thinking past it. At the threshold, she paused. For what it's worth, the interview in November. The position was filled internally, which was accurate. But I moved through the conversation too quickly. That was not a fair reflection of your file. He looked at her. She held his gaze without flinching. Thank you, he said. He took the stairs down 14 floors. He needed the time. The call from Victoria's assistant came Monday. The formal interview was set for Thursday. On Wednesday morning, Ethan opened his laptop while Sophie finished her cereal and found 3 notifications from a business newsfeed he used to monitor commercial property activity. Hail Dynamics was in the headlines. He read quickly, the way he read technical documents with potential consequences, looking for the shape of the problem before the specifics. A former board member named Gerald Ashworth had given an interview to a business publication. The claims were strategic in their vagueness, that the company had misrepresented its financial position during a restructuring period 9 years ago to secure a financing arrangement, that this misrepresentation had been directed from the executive level, and that documentation existed that would support these claims. Ethan read the piece twice. Then he called the number on the business card the assistant had given him. He expected a receptionist. Victoria Hale answered on the second ring. I saw the story, he said. A brief pause. I assumed you might. Ashworth is in the journal. The March entries. He's the board member who proposed the position cuts. A longer pause. You remember the specifics. I tend to remember what I read. It's a useful habit in my work. He paused. The journal documents the decision process in real time. If someone is claiming you misrepresented the company's financial position to secure financing, the journal would establish that you were fully aware of the risk and documented it contemporaneously in detail and without self-serving omission. That's not the record of someone concealing information. That's the record of someone being very honest with themselves about what they were doing. He heard her take a breath. My attorneys have made a similar argument. The complication is establishing that the journal is contemporaneous rather than constructed after the fact. Paper and ink can be dated. And the building on Carver Street will have lease records. A 9-year-old tenancy document establishes that you occupied that apartment during the period covered by the journal. A personal item left accidentally behind a shelf with documented purchase receipts, is not a planned act. It's exactly what it looks like. Silence. I have hardware store receipts from when I built the shelf, he said. I keep receipts. Every purchase, logged. The pine boards and the mounting hardware same day, 26 months ago. The shelf had been there for 2 years when I pulled it down. That's a documented chain of custody that Ashworth's people would have difficulty challenging. A longer silence. How are you doing this? She asked. Doing what? Thinking through this. You're a facilities manager. I'm the person who found the journal, he said. And I think carefully about what things mean before I decide what to do with them. It's how I was taught to approach any system problem. Understand the whole thing before you touch anything. He heard Sophie push her chair back from the table. I have to take my daughter to school. If your attorneys want to speak with me, I'm available. Thursday is still on, she said. If you're still willing. I'm still willing. He closed the laptop and helped Sophie into her coat. She told him about a dream involving a talking elevator and a very complicated argument about which floor to go to. He listened carefully. The dream had, in her telling, a clear internal logic that rewarded attention. He met with 2 of Hale Dynamics' outside counsel on Tuesday, the day before the formal interview. They met in a small conference room on the 12th floor. He noted the floor number, not the 14th, not the executive level, and thought this might be deliberate, a way of maintaining appropriate separation until the legal situation had clarity. He did not object to this. It made sense. The attorneys were methodical and thorough and extremely interested in the shelf. He described it in the detail he would use to write a work order. Dimensions, wood species, finish, mounting hardware type and size, bracket configuration, date of installation. He had the hardware store receipt on his phone. He photographed receipts and filed them in a folder organized by month and year. A habit born of financial necessity that had, in this particular instance, become something more useful than he had anticipated. The receipt for the pine boards was dated 26 months ago. The receipt for the mounting hardware matched the same date, and the journal was behind the shelf when you removed it, the first attorney said, wedged between the board and the plaster. It would not have been visible or accessible without removing the shelf. I only removed the shelf because I had forgotten it when I packed. I was moving in the middle of a snowstorm with a 6-year-old in the truck. I forgot the shelf. The attorney wrote something. He watched without being able to read it. The second attorney looked up from the document in front of him. Mr. Brooks, did you have any prior relationship with Miss Hale or any employee of this company before the November interview? No prior relationship. I applied through the public listing. I had not been in this building before that day. And the journal's contents, did you reproduce them in any form? Share them with any third party? Photograph any pages? No. He paused. I thought carefully about what I had. I decided the right thing to do was to return it. That's what I did. The silence of people deciding whether they believe you. He had sat in enough such silences to recognize it not suspicious, not credulous, simply the professional work of assessment. Thank you, Mr. Brooks, the first attorney said. This is genuinely useful. Gerald Ashworth's interview. It emerged in the following week, had rested entirely on his own recollection of events from 9 years ago. No contemporaneous documentation, no records beyond what his memory provided. The journal was submitted through counsel and authenticated through paper dating, and corroborated by building management records from the Carver Street address. The chain of custody was documented by hardware store receipts, a moving company log, and Ethan's own statement. The business publication issued a correction. Ashworth's attorneys went quiet. Ethan read about it in 3 paragraphs near the bottom of a news item. Sophie was drawing at the kitchen table beside him. He set the laptop aside and helped her choose between 2 shades of blue for the sky in her picture. She chose both. He thought this was probably correct. On Thursday, he wore the borrowed tie. He returned it to Douglas that evening with a bottle of whiskey purchased specifically for the purpose. And Douglas accepted both without comment, which was the appropriate response and, probably, Ethan thought, the highest form of grace available between men of their generation and temperament. The conversation on the 14th floor lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. He tracked this in the back of his mind, the way he tracked everything. Automatically. The way you track a system you are responsible for. It was not an interview in the conventional sense. It moved more quickly than interviews moved, was more specific, looped back on itself when something required clarification, and spent large portions of its time on actual problems rather than on hypothetical scenarios about how he might approach problems. Victoria had 3 properties in the portfolio, with unresolved operational issues. They worked through them one at a time. He asked questions, she answered them with precision, and the collaboration had a quality he recognized from the best technical work he had done. The feeling of 2 people who think about the same kind of thing in compatible ways, each making the other's reasoning faster. On the second property, she said, the specialist we brought in called it unresolvable, without a full system retrofit. The system is undersized for the current occupancy, Ethan said. That's accurate. But a full retrofit isn't the only path. You could stage it, replace the primary units in the highest occupancy zones first, and run them in parallel with the existing system through the transition. Costs more in year 1, less overall, and the building stays operational throughout. That's not what he recommended. He recommended the simplest implementation path. He paused, aware of the line he was walking. I don't know his reasoning. He may have had factors I'm not seeing. She made a note. He didn't. They moved through the 3rd problem. Partway through his analysis, he noticed that she had stopped looking at her notes and was simply looking at him, following the thread of what he was working out the way you follow the logic of something resolving toward an answer you hadn't expected but find credible. At the end, she said, Director of Facilities Operations. 11 properties, 8-person team, Capital Planning Authority, full operational scope. More senior than the November role. I know. I read the job description when I arrived. And I can do it. He said this simply, without performance or qualification. It was the most direct claim he had made in a long time, and it felt, when he said it, exactly accurate, not optimistic, not self-promotional, simply true. I believe you, she said. He had not expected her to say this. He was not sure, precisely, what he had expected, but not stated directly, without hedging or the professional distance of we'll be in touch. The offer will come through HR. Standard process, a few days. She stood. He stood. They shook hands across the desk, the river below them, and the white city beyond it, and the handshake was brief and level and unambiguous, the kind between people who have established what they think of each other and are only confirming it formally. The job started on the 1st of March. He wore the work boots, not the tie. His team was 8 people. He met each of them in the first week, one at a time. In conversations that he kept specific and brief, he asked about the problems they were carrying, the things that hadn't been resolved under the interim coverage, the decisions they had been waiting for someone with authority to make. He listened without performing sympathy or manufacturing urgency. He made notes and followed up on every item within the week. One member of the team, a building systems technician named Ray, 26 years old, who had applied for the director role himself and not received it, watched Ethan's first week with the contained wariness of someone deciding whether to be hostile or merely reserved. Ethan addressed this directly on Wednesday of the second week. "You applied for this job," he said. Ray looked at him with professional flatness. "Yes, you were right to. You know this portfolio better than I do yet, and you have technical knowledge that will take me time to match." He paused. "I'm going to be direct with you because I find it saves time. I need someone who understands these systems from the inside." "That's you. What I'm offering is operational lead on the day-to-day. You know what that means in practice better than I can define it right now. And I mean this genuinely. Your job is to push back on me when I'm wrong. I need to be corrected before decisions are made, not after." Ray considered this for a moment with the expression of someone applying a rigorous standard. "What does operational lead mean for comp?" he asked. "I'm working on that," Ethan said. "I have a budget conversation with Victoria next week, and that's on the list." "Okay," Ray said. And they went back to work. The whiteboard in Ethan's kitchen changed. Rent remained. Utilities remained. Groceries remained at a slightly more generous number. Sophie's after-school program remained. And beside it, in the same blue marker, he added the name of the art room teacher, Mrs. Holt, because Sophie talked about her enough that the name had become infrastructure of their household in the way that anything mentioned daily eventually does. A new column appeared on the right side of the board in April. He wrote the word savings at the top, small and deliberate. He erased it at the end of the month, the same as the others. Then he wrote it again, at the top of May's column. Victoria came down to the operations floor twice in his first month. Once for a genuine issue with the building management software, a permissions conflict that required a decision above Ray's clearance level, and once, he was reasonably certain, simply to see how things were going. She said nothing beyond what was necessary on either visit. He had come to understand, a strong preference for letting outcomes establish themselves rather than commenting on them prematurely. He had the same preference. It made the working relationship efficient. They ate lunch in the building cafeteria on the last Friday of March accidentally. In the sense that they arrived at the same time, and the room was full except for one table. They sat across from each other with their trays and talked through the staging plan for the HVAC retrofit, which was in its second phase and on schedule. Which was the natural subject they had in common, and which was, at that moment, enough. Near the end of lunch she asked, in the same flat indicative she used for everything, how Sophie was adjusting. "She named a pigeon," Ethan said. Victoria looked at him with an expression that moved, at its outer edge, toward something like amusement. Not performed, just present. A pigeon. Several times. Different names. She considers it a continuous relationship with the same individual. "That seems reasonable," Victoria said, and stood to take her tray. He watched her cross the cafeteria and thought about the journal entry. "I wonder sometimes if the people in this building know that someone is working very hard to keep them here, and thought that some things sustained in themselves without recognition, not because they were indifferent to being known, but because the work itself was the point." He had always understood this. He had not always had the circumstances to act on it. He thought he did now. The thaw came late that year. The way it always did in Ravenhill, reluctantly. In stages, the river going from solid ice to gray water with visible current in the span of 2 slow weeks in April. The park on Archer Street kept its snow longer than anywhere else in the neighborhood, sheltered on 3 sides by the surrounding buildings, and the fountain stayed wrapped in its burlap covering until the temperature held above freezing for 5 consecutive days. On the Saturday, it was finally unwrapped. Ethan and Sophie walked through the park on their way to the hardware store, where he was buying materials for a new shelf. Maple this time, not pine. Better hardware. He had measured the wall carefully the previous evening, while Sophie told him about a documentary she had seen at school about migratory birds, which she was connecting, in ways that had their own internal logic, to the situation with Captain. Sophie stopped at the fountain. The basin was clean and dry, the mechanism visible where the burlap had been removed, not yet running. waiting for the official turn-on that the Parks Department scheduled each year for the second week of May. "Is the water coming back?" she asked. "In a few weeks, once everything is ready." She studied the fountain for a moment, with the assessing expression she used for things she was deciding how to feel about. "The pigeons will be glad," she said. "Probably." She took his hand, and they walked on through the park, which was mostly brown at the ground level but carrying, at the edges of things at the base of the trees, along the fence line near the entrance, the faint suggestion of something returning. Not visible yet, not quite, but present in the quality of the light, which was different from February's light, in a way that was real but difficult to describe. You had to be paying attention to notice it. He was paying attention. He thought about systems, about building systems, specifically, which were the thing he understood best. The visible surface and the working interior were always different things. The most important work happened where you could not see it, in the ducts behind the walls, in the pipes beneath the floors, in the decisions made in private that held the whole structure together. You maintained those systems. You paid attention to them. You made good decisions about them when it mattered, regardless of whether anyone was watching. Especially regardless of whether anyone was watching. He thought about a journal entry written 9 years ago by a woman in an apartment on Carver Street, at a desk near a window with a particular quality of winter light. "I wonder sometimes if the people in this building know that someone is working very hard to keep them here." He thought that this was, in the end, the cleanest summary he had encountered of what it meant to do the work without needing the credit for it. He did not know yet what was going to happen, in any of the dimensions of his life where things were still forming. That was not a comfortable position, and he did not pretend it was. But it was better than it had been. The column on the whiteboard existed now. The shelf in his kitchen was sturdier than the last one. Sophie had a teacher who told her the clouds were very good. He had a job he was capable of, and a team he was beginning to understand, and a conversation, taken a floor at a time, that was still in its early stages. These were not small things. "Can we get a bird feeder?" Sophie asked. As they came through the park entrance, onto the street, where would we put it? The kitchen window. Captain would come. Captain might come, he said. She accepted this with the equanimity of someone who has learned that possibility is the right category for most things. And that possibility is considerably better than nothing, which is what you have before you have it. They walked out into the pale April light, her hand in his, the hardware store 2 blocks ahead, the new shelf already measured and planned.